On the front page of BIS 7 today, we look at the very politically charged and sensitive issue about Namibia's apparent image as a corrupt country, and we explore various opinions on whether that is fact and fiction. Joining us in the studio to look at this in a bit more depth is Christie Keulder. He, of course, is a political scientist at Survey Warehouse, sorry about that, but also the national investigator for Afrobarometer in Namibia. Welcome, Christie, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the difficult question immediately. We hear from government, we hear from state-owned organizations, etc. The immediate response, once there is an article or comments regarding a corruption or a new index coming out, that these indexes are based on perception. Yes, some of that indeed is true if one looks at the heavyweight like the Corruption Perception Index. It is perception based, but how important is the whole issue of perception about an issue like corruption?
Yes, well, I think it's of course it's important, otherwise it wouldn't get the attention that it's getting. But I think perhaps one need to understand first what is corruption and what makes it different from other forms of financial misconduct, if I can put it that way. Corruption is when somebody uses a public office for their own gain or for the gain of others. So that makes it different from fraud or money laundering or those kinds of things. All these other financial misconducts may make up part of corruption, but corruption necessarily involves a public office. So civil servants, politicians, people who are working with public money, is misusing those positions to gain a benefit or to extend a benefit to others. I think the issue around perception, of course, is an issue that it's a valid issue in the sense that we need to understand how does perception link up with hard cases of corruption or real corruption figures. And having said that, we need to acknowledge that it's very difficult to assess hard corruption or real corruption because it's illegal activities, it's punishable by law, so people are not going to go up and reveal the extent to which they engage in the misuse of public office. So those are the two things. I think it is important, but at the same time, perceptions are used to measure or give us an indication of the level of corruption, even if it's a perceived level of corruption, because we don't know how far or how big the problem really is. Having said that, that doesn't mean to say that perceptions can't tell us something about the extent of corruption. And as you know, most of the indexes make perception or is based on perceptions of either specialists or experts, or some of them are based on the perceptions of ordinary people, citizens. So those are two different ways that these perceptions are gathered.
So it would be correct to say one can't just dismiss a report or an index because it's based on perception.
No, you can't. I think there are a couple of important things. One is that, of course, surveys that look at the citizen level of perceptions do normally include some kind of battery of questions probing for actual experience. And this we normally measure as bribery. A citizen paying or giving a gift in order to access a public office. And the recipient then, the occupant of that office, receives that gift or that sort of a bribe. But that kind of corruption does not reflect the kind of corruption that has become prevalent in the world today, not just in Namibia or any part of Africa. That involves public office, business people, professionals like lawyers, accountants, bankiers. All these people are implicated in a plethora and an explosion of the so-called secret world, where money is laundered outside national boundaries. It's hidden through a wide range of financial instruments. So, of course, bribery does not reflect that. The ordinary citizens are not part of this secret world that has become a very prevalent elite exercise.
Indeed, the secret world as you've mentioned, it's also extremely complex. So it's very difficult to expose because it's experts that are working with it.
Yeah, I think, the ordinary person having to bribe a way to get into school or getting a medical service or getting access to the police is almost petty corruption. It's small amounts of money, relatively small amounts of money. It can all add up in the long run. But once you start looking at the level of money that is laundered and that is pushed around, that becomes a completely different kettle of fish. And it's very difficult for any individual to engage in the scale of that kind of activity and not be noticed. So the role of these intermediaries, the bankers, the lawyers, the accountants, becomes a really important part in setting up front companies or shell companies, creating trusts for money to be shifted, buying properties and so forth. So it's really complicated.
You've been very involved basically at the center of the Afrobarometer for the past years. Looking back at the experience that you've gained, how would you describe the situation when it comes to corruption in Namibia? Is it getting worse?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. The one is, if we look at the evidence that's already sort of starting to come out around fish rot, for example, I think it's clear that Namibia has joined this international network, very sophisticated, very complicated, and that means that the scope of corruption has really increased. So there are other cases too, but this is just an obvious one. But I also think one need to understand where these perceptions, the ordinary person's perceptions of corruption, come from. And that's the next stage that we're interested in our research, is to find out what drives these perceptions. There are, of course, academics that argue that actually what people are doing is they're expressing their discontent with a specific set of issues. Poverty, for example, inequality, lack of services, inadequate social security, and so forth. So once I don't get what I think I should have, or once the economic conditions in the country gets to the point where I think it's because of corruption, then people tend to think that corruption has gone out. For me, I think personally, and again, I mean, I don't have insight in all these deals that have been made, but simply the number of cases and the scope of cases, the amount of money that's involved in several of these things seem to suggest that there has been an increase in corruption at the elite level, not the ordinary level.
When I went through all these websites where Namibia is profiled, largely for people who would like to consider investing in the country, there are two very distinct things that are said. One is immediately, it is said that Namibia has the legal instruments. We've got what we need to tackle this problem. And then on the other hand, it is pointed out time and time again that we simply do not use these legal tools that we have to tackle the issue. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I agree, but I also think that there are a number of issues that we could easily do, or maybe not that easily, but that could go a long way in terms of eradicating at least some of the problem. And that, for example, is to prevent civil servants from being businessmen. That's a very obvious thing to do, especially at a certain level, because, as I say, the type of corruption that seems to be prevalent now, or has become prevalent over the past number of years, involves, at the very elite level, politicians, business people, that interaction. And then often, it's not necessarily all local. There's a very international component to that too. So I think, yes, I think the problem is, though, that there's no real explanation for why we still try and get away from the fact that maybe there is corruption. We're not acknowledging it. I think even at a bribery level, if 1 in 10 Namibians have to pay or gift a civil servant, then the question should be, but why? Why should 1 in 10 of our citizens have to bribe their way into getting a service that they're entitled to have by the Constitution. And I think the idea that we're trying to say, well, that's not a big problem, is maybe sort of indicative of the fact that we don't really want to deal with a problem, or we don't know how to deal with a problem.
If you say that we don't know how to deal, or we don't want to deal with the problem, is it because the issue of corruption, there's a lot of politics around it? Acknowledging that there is a corruption problem might reflect badly on government?
Well, you see, even if we assume that ordinary people's perceptions on corruption is driven by the fact that they're poor, the fact that they struggle to get access to services, the fact that they think inequality in the country is growing, the fact that they think the economy is going in the wrong direction, all those things are actually indicators of government's performance. So when corruption is driven by those kinds of perceptions, that also reflects that government's responsible for driving those perceptions, right? It would be difficult for somebody to think my state of economic despair is caused by somebody else stealing state money if I don't feel that my well-being is that much under threat. So I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in one way or another. Because the other important thing is that behavior is shaped by perceptions. So if I believe that this particular official in front of me is corrupt, then I will act as if it's corrupt, he or she. And I would sort of start soliciting these bribes and offering them in order for me to get things done. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's also, if we want to address where these perceptions come from, we need to understand what their sources are, and then we need to speak to those sources. So either way, government cannot get away from the fact that it does play a part in shaping these perceptions.
We could continue this conversation for a very long time, but unfortunately we're going to have to stick with what we've got at the moment. Christie, thank you very much for joining us and your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.